Hello guys, and welcome back to new Kotlin Multiplatform project. So in this project, we're going to learn how to make API calls, and specifically we're going to use Ktor in order to make these API calls. So without any further ado, let's get started. So basically what we're going to build here is this simple application where we're going to get this data from the mill database. And basically we're going to get information of different data here. So you can see this is just a scrollable, and we are fetching the data through an internet, and the images we're using coil in order to load the data. And basically here we can, for example, whenever we like this, we can just click here and fetch the data and get the preparation information on how to prepare it. So we can create this for both iOS, Android, and also desktop. So let's get started. Okay, so the first case here is to get our library versions. So you can just directly go to our version catalog here. So I have declared these dependencies. So you can just easily go to the GitHub link provided in the description box and copy the libraries, and you are just good to go. So basically here what I have added, you can see where you're going to use Ktor, and basically we're going to use Ktor 3 beta, and also we're going to use Kotlin coroutines. Another case, we are going to use a view model, and we're going to use coil for image loading, and also we're going to use Kotlin coroutine swing for desktop. So basically here I have declared these libraries. So you can see we have Ktor core, which is necessary, the Ktor negotiation, which is necessary whenever we want to negotiate or we want to convert our data from JSON to Kotlin, and also whenever we want to log in. And here we are specifying different Ktor clients. So this one, they differ differently from different operating system. So Darwin is directly going to iOS and also Mac OS, and OKHTTP can be used in desktop and as well as Android. And also here we're going to use coroutine core and also coroutine in Androids, and also Kotlin serialization for serializing JSON data to Kotlin data classes, the view model, and other. For example, here we are going to have the coil for composables and coil for network, and also coil composable and other things which we are going to have here. Another case, inside here, the plugins, I'm going to use this Kotlin X serialization library for serializing our data. So next, we can directly go to our compose. And inside here, our compose, let's go directly to our common dependencies. And here I want to declare all the dependencies which we have. Okay, so all of these are just going to go inside our common source set. So these one are inside our common source set. We can directly go to our Android source set. And basically here we can add for the implementations for example, Kotlin coroutines, and also for Kotlin client, which is just OKHTTP. The next case, we can directly go to desktop main. Okay, so here we're going to add the client, which is OKHTTP. And also we are going to use coroutine swing in order to get the coroutines available in desktop. Another case, here we can declare, for example, iOS. So we can declare here iOS dependencies, and inside here we want to use Darwin. So basically if you want to use iOS and Mac OS, basically you can just declare these dependencies here, and basically they're going to use a Darwin client. So lastly, we can navigate inside here plugins at the top. Then we can keep this dependency for Kotlin serialization and sync our project, and everything is going to work perfectly fine. Now we have set up our database perfectly, so let's just switch to project. Okay, now we can go directly here to our compose main, and basically let's create here our new package. And this directory, we're going to call it data. Basically we're going to follow an MVVM structure. So for here we want to call network. And inside here, I want to create another directory. You can call this models, where we're going to insert the models. So for this case, we are going to look at the API which we're going to use in order to fetch the data. Okay, so this is the database which we're going to use, basically the milldatabase.com. It's a free API, so you can just select here API, then it's going to direct you here. Okay, so for this case, I'm going to use this one, filter by area. So we can just copy this. And here, basically, we can change, for example, to British. Okay, so you can see here we are having the data which is going to be returned. And basically, it returns a list of mills. So for this case, I'm just going to click copy this. Then we are going to go to Android Studio and basically use this data to convert it back to our Kotlin data classes. Okay, so inside here, we can easily create these models. So basically, I'm going to use a plugin. So you can press, for example, Ctrl-Alt-S and go directly to plugins here. And inside here, you can see I have installed this JSON to Kotlin data classes. So you can just easily search inside here the marketplace and install this plugin here, which is going to be crucial to create your data. So for this case, let's insert here and we can use this, create Kotlin file from this. Then we can paste here the JSON. Okay, so we have here our JSON and we want to convert this. Another case, whenever you install this, you can just click advanced and you can set this as how I have set it here. Then you can select here the annotation. So inside here, the annotation is going to be to none. You can select this Kotlin X serialization and click OK. Here we have to create and call this meals. So for example, let's just call meals and click generate. Then it's going to add these two data classes. So you can see we have here meals. And basically this one is going to be, and also we have another data class that is going to be the ID and string meal. And that is all what is going to be returned from the database which we have. Okay, now this one is going to return a detail for list of meals. Now, whenever we want to look for a specific meal, then we have to send another request. And basically here we can use the ID one. So you can see lookup full meal. So we can just copy this. And here basically it's going to return this data. So you can see it's going to return a list. And basically we can just copy this. Let's go back to Android Studio. And inside here, let's insert and create a new Kotlin class. Let's paste it here and click format. Okay, so inside here, we are going to call this meal item because it's just a single item and click generate. Then it's going to add new Kotlin classes. So we can inspect them. You can see we have a lot of data. So I'm going to do a cleanup here to leave the variables which we are going to specifically need here because this one is going to spill out a lot of information. So let me do a cleanup first. Okay, so here what I'm going to leave is the meal ID, also the area, instruction, and that meal itself, and also the thumbnail, which we can easily fetch that particular image, so the URL. Okay, another item here which has been created is the meals. That is going to give us meals here as a list. And we're going to see how we can easily work with this data. Okay, so here we have our network. I want to create here another class that is going to be a util. So let's create a new Kotlin class of file. And this one is just going to be object. That is going to hold us a constant data, which we're going to save this inside here. Okay, so I'm going to save the host. Basically is the host which we are going to communicate. That is the meal database and also the API path. So we have the first path, which is going to return us the data with a specific location, that is the endpoint. And another endpoint is this lookup path, that is basically which we are going to look for a certain object, only one item. So this one, you're going to see how we are going to use them whenever we create our data. So here we want to create a utils, basically, directly. Let's call this utils. And organize our data. Let's refactor this to here. Okay, so inside here, our utils, we want to create another class that is going to be a response. So this one is going to help us whenever we send a request. We want to get a response class that we can easily use to manage. And this one is just a generic class. Okay, so we have the first case. So let's make this sealed. Okay, so here we have the loading state. So whenever we are loading here, and this one is just our response. We can duplicate this 3 times. So here, whenever we have error. So for error here, we want to pass in a variable that is going to be error. And this is just a throwable and it can be nullable. Lastly, here we have the success. And for success part here, we're going to receive the data, which is going to be of type T. Okay, so these are important. The next case we want to create is a repository, which we can use to fetch the data. So let's go inside here, our data, and create our repository. Okay, so let's create here our Kotlin class, and let's call this repository. Okay, so here we have a repository. So I want to pass in here a dependency that is the client, which is basically HTTP client and can be different from different operating systems. Okay, so here I want to create a function that is going to fetch the meals. And here basically we can pass in the location as our parameter. So you can make this at runtime and let the user pass the location. So for our case, we're just going to hard code this. Okay, so this one is going to return a flow. And it's going to be of type response. Okay, so we can open up here the flow, which is going to perform asynchronously. Okay, so the first case, I want to emit here a value, and this one is going to be loading. So we can just call here response.loading and tell, hey, now we are starting to fetch our data. So we can show here our progress. Okay, for that case, we can now make the network request. So we can just call here a mail.dto, which is a data transfer object. So what we can do is call the client.get, which is basically going to make the get request. Okay, so inside here, we can configure now where are we going to fetch that request. So for example, we want to use a URL in order to make this request. So we can configure by using this URL opening here. Then after that, we have to specify, for example, the protocol. Okay, so what protocol are we going to use? So for our case, we are going to use a URL protocol, HTTPS, because this is using HTTPS protocols. Then we can configure also the host. Okay, so here we can use the host, which is the mail database we have stored inside our constant. Then we can specify the path. Where are we going to fetch this? Basically, we have already declared the path. And another case, we can pass in here the parameters. Okay, so here we are passing a URL parameter. So for a case, the first parameter was A, which basically stands for area or location. So for this case, we can pass in here now that parameter. So we can just call here location. And now we have configured our URL. After performing this get function, now we want to transform this to a particular data class. So basically here we have a HTTP response. So we want to call .body, which is going to help us to convert this to a certain data type. So for this data type here, we are going to pass in here to be a meal. Okay, so we have here our meals. Now, after we perform this, we have to emit so that we can tell, hey, we have successfully fetched the data. So for this case, we can just call here response.success. And pass in here our mail.dto. So thus we have a success. Now, whenever we have any error, we can just catch here. We can use this catch. Now here we can emit that error which we are going to receive. So here we have error. Okay, then we can pass in here our throwable, which is just the error. Now we can easily duplicate this function. Let's just press Ctrl D. And now we want to fetch a meal by ID. So we can change here the parameter. Now we can just pass in here the ID to be of type string. Okay, so instead here we have to pass in the meal item. Okay, so we're getting here an error because we are not sending the same response. Okay, so the first case is we want to change here is the path. So here we're going to use the lookup path because it's differently. So we can change the lookup path, and the parameter here instead of A is I. And basically here we can pass in the ID. And here we are going to return meal items and not meals. So you can see the error is going to go away, and everything we are going to leave it as it is. So we have here our two functions, that is fetching meal by ID and also fetching the meals. So now we have here our HTTP client. So I want to set up a graph that is going to help us to inject these dependencies. So we're going to use manual dependency injections so that I cannot confuse you with dependency injections. So for this case, we can easily just create inside here our Kotlin. Let's create a new object. Let's call this graph. Okay, so I want to create here a variable that is just going to be a HTTP client. So let's make this a private variable and we can call this HTTP client. And we can use a lazy. So this by lazy here is going to initialize a variable lazily, meaning that whenever it's going to be needed, then it's going to initialize. And if not, then we are not going to occupy the resource by initializing this at creating this application. So for this case, we can call HTTP client. Okay, so here we have our HTTP client. So you can see we can create an asynchronous HTTP client with specified configurations. So for example, here you can pass in an engine. So inside here, you can see we can pass in a HTTP client engine specifically. So if you want to use Darwin or OK HTTP and different engines here. So if we leave this empty, basically this HTTP client is going to configure it by default going specifically from that operating system. So if it's in Android or desktop, then it can use, for example, OK HTTP. And if it's in macOS operating systems, then it can use Darwin engine. So for this case, we are just going to leave it empty so that it can configure it by itself. So for our case, we want to install here several features. So whenever you want to add logging, and other things, so for example, you can just call here install, and here you can pass in that particular item. So for our case, we want to pass in here the login feature so that we can be able to log our network request and different things. And if you want to configure it, so you can just open up here and configure your logging and other things like that. So for a case, we want to install also the content negotiation. So for content negotiation, it's going to help us to negotiate between the conversion of JSON to Kotlin data classes. And for this, let's create here our content negotiation. And inside here, we want to call JSON. Okay, so inside here, we have to specify that JSON which we have. So for our case, we can just call here JSON, and we want to configure several parameters. So the first parameter is to ignore unknown keys. And by default, this is false. We want to set it to true. So for example, inside here, our meals, so you can see meals item. Inside here, meal X, you can see we had a long data classes, but we have deleted and we want only to have these variables which we have specified here. So otherwise our app is going to crash because it's going to receive data which they don't understand. So for this case, we can just easily do this inside our content negotiation here. We specify these unknown keys, and basically our app is not going to crash. And another case is we want to coerce input values. Okay, so this coerce input values, you can see it's going to enable coercing incorrect JSON values to default properties. So for example, if we have a value that is not nullable, then this one is supposed to be null. Then we can use this to coerce and not crash our application. Okay, so we have configured here our HTTP client. Now we want to provide our repository. So we can create here a variable. Let's call this repository. And similarly, we can use by lazy. Now we can construct our repository. Okay, so inside here, we can pass in the HTTP client directly. So we have our graph. Now we can proceed with the next part. Okay, so inside here, want to create a new package. So let's call this directory and call this home. Okay, so inside here, let's create a home view model. So we are following an MVVM structure. So let's create here home view model. Okay, so inside here, we want to create a variable that is the repository. And inside here, we can directly inject this by using the graph. dot repository. Okay, so you have to create here a state, and basically we can create here a data class that is called home state. Now we are going to receive meals, which is going to be a list. Basically, we're going to receive only a list of meals and not meals. So basically, we want a single item of that particular meal. And by default, this is just an empty list. The next case is if we are loading. So we can just call this is loading. And when we are starting, we are not loading. So we can keep this false. And whenever we have any error, it's just going to be of type string that is nullable by default. Okay, so after that, we can declare a state. So I have here a live template. So we can just call this home state. And here we want to pass in the home state as our class. Okay, so this wants to import this particular extension. Okay, so whenever we initialize this view model and want to make the request, so we can use the view model scope. Okay, so inside here we can call a repository dot fetch meals. So here we are fetching all the meals and we want to collect this. So let's call this result. Okay, so here we are receiving a result that is just a response. So you can see response of meals. So here we can use a when statement to configure this. So we can check here our result. Then let's check if this is going to be loading. And then here we can change our home state. We want to update it. So we can call here it.copy. And set is loading back to true. And if previously we have errors, we can just keep this to be nullable. Okay, let's duplicate this 3 times. So instead of loading here is whenever we have success. So for loading here, we can keep this back to false. And if we had an error, we can keep it to null. The next thing which is changing here is the meals. So we can easily call here our result data, which is going to give us the meals. So we can call .meals, which is just a list. Okay, so we have here our response when it is successfully. So we can just copy this, paste it here, and here whenever we have error. Okay, so when we have error, so loading, we can just keep this back to false. And we can pass in here the error message. So we can call here our result. And now we can get the error. So this error is going to be a string. So we can just call this message here. Okay, so this is our result and we have fetched our data. So now everything is looking perfectly. So here I think we have added more brackets. Okay, so other than that, everything is looking well. Okay, so we have our view model. So in the next case here, I want to create the home screen. So let's create here a new Kotlin class and let's call this home screen and we can select file. Okay, let's create here a new composable and we can call this home screen. Okay, so here we want to get the view model. Okay, so we can call this home view model, and because directly here we can instantiate this by creating the view model by using the view model composable. Okay, so the view model is going to be constructed. So we have to get the state. So we can call here home state. Now let's call here our home view model. And we want to collect this as a state. Okay, so everything is going to be surrounded inside the column. So here we can pass in the modifier. Okay, so the first case I want to check if we are loading. Basically, we can show now the regular indicator. So here we can just call here our home state dot is loading. So here we can show a circular progress indicator. The next case is we can check if we have any error, so we can display that error. So we can just call here home state dot error. Now we can check if this error is not going to be equal to nullable. So if it's not null, basically we have an error. So we can show here a text. So here we can show an error or empty, because this can be nullable string. And here basically we can show it. So you can configure and manage the errors more efficiently. So for now, we're just going to display it to the user. So after that, we were going to create our view inside a vertical grid. So we are going to show side by side two items. So we can use a lazy vertical grid. Okay, so here we can specify the number of columns which we want our grid to have. So for a case, we can use grid cells. So you can use, for example, adaptive. So we want just to use fixed, which is going to give us, and we want to use not 3, 2 columns. Okay, so inside here, we are going to have items, which we can use our state now. So let's call here a home state, which meals. Now here we're going to have the meal. Okay, so we have to import that extension. Now the next case, I want to create the food item, which is just going to show us that item. So let's create here a new composable. Let's call this food item, or you can call meal item, whatever you want. So here we're going to get the meal and also the on meal click. Which is going to be a lambda function that returns a unit. So we're going to pass in that event. So we are using a unidirectional. Okay, so for this case, we can create here a box. So the first case, we can pass in here the modifier. And we can give it this padding to be 16 dp. And also we can make this clickable. So whenever we click, we can call here on meal item click and invoke it directly here. Okay, let's wrap this modifier for better view. Okay, so the first item here, I want to show the image. Then after that image, we are going to show the text. For this, we are going to use async image that is coming from a coil image routing library. So we can just call async image. And basically here we can pass in the model. So the model is anything that can be a URL, or you can use something to fetch a particular image directly from locally. So for a case, we are just getting this from an API. So we can just call here meal. We want this string term, which is basically a URL for that particular image. Another case, I want to specify here a modifier. So the first, I want to fill the max width. Then we can give a set of height. So for a case, we want to give it a height to be 200 dp. So you can change it to whatever you want. Another case, I want to clip this to be inside a rounded corner shape. So we can use clip and specify a certain shape. So you can use any type of shape. So for my case, I'm just going to use this rounded corner shape and give it 8 dp for shapes to be rounded. The next case is you can provide the content description. So for my case, I'm just going to give this null. Another case, you can use the content scale. So you can use, for example, content scale but crop, which is going to scale it universally and crop it if the image is bigger than the size we have specified. And if we have any errors, we can show here a painter resource. So for a case, we can directly use the res dot, let's call drawables. So let's use this image directly here. So you can provide a custom image insert that directly. But for case, let's just keep it simple. Okay, and if we have any error whenever we are fetching the data, so here we have the state, which it has its own state. Basically, we can get from this state that error. So we can call here result dot robo, and we want to print the structures. So we can call print structures so that we can see, hey, inside this image we have an error. So, and this text is going to be inside a certain view. So we can create here a surface to customize this. So let's just create here a surface. So we can fill the max width also. And I want to align this to the bottom center. So we can call here alignment. Then the next case, I can change the color. So for color, I'm going to use a material theme. Dot colors, and we can select the surface. And I want to copy this to create an opacity for this image, a particular background. So we can use 0.5f, that is the alpha, which we're going to provide here. Okay, so inside here, I can create another box. So let's give the content alignment. So we want the data inside here to be aligned at the center. And give it a modifier. Let's first give it a padding of 80 dp, and we can fill the max width. Now inside here, let's create a text, and this text here. Now we can use our mil.string mil, which is going to be the name of that particular mil. We can change the font weight. So I want the weight to be bold. And let's give the modifier padding. And horizontally, we want to give it a padding of 4 dp. Our food item. So directly we can just go inside here. And here we can pass in the meals, and we have the on click here. So we can call here on meal item click. Okay, so we have the on click. We did not specify here the on meal click. So, and instead here we have to pass in the meal. So we have the on meal click. But here now I want to pass a parameter that is the meal. So inside here I can just call the on meal click. So we can just call here the meal and pass it. So now our home screen is completed. Let's directly open up here and go to app. So we're going to delete this information which is here. And now directly here we can call our home screen. Okay, so let's try to run first and see if our application is actually functional. So we can directly go here and run our application. Okay, so before we run here, basically we're going to get an error because we have to fix some things in case of Android. So for this case, let's directly go to Android main. So before we run this, we have to go to Android manifest. And here we have to declare that, hey, we are using internet because we're going to use a permission here. So we can just call uses permission and Android internet. Now we can just close this. Now we are good to go. Let's try to run this in Android first. Okay, so our app is launched successfully, and you can see here we are fetching the data. And here whenever we try to click, nothing is happening, but you can see everything is working perfectly. And here we have our data we have fetched from the internet. Let's try to run this inside our desktop environment. So we can create here a new configuration for this. So let's click here, new configuration. We can select Gradle, and here we can call desktop run. Here we can call main class. Okay, so you can see here our app is launched successfully, and we are inside the desktop environment, and you can see everything is looking perfectly as how we intended. So we have here our desktop, and also here we have our Android application running also. Okay, so for that case, we have here our home screen. So the next case, we want also to display the detailed screen for our items. So for this case, let's just click cancel this. Let's go directly here to home. And we want to create here a new package. Sorry. So let's create here a new directory. Let's call this detail. Okay, so for detail here, we can create a new Kotlin class and call detail viewmodel. Similarly here, we're going to receive a repository. Okay, so here we want to create our state. So let's just go inside here. We can copy this. Okay, so let's go back to our detail view model. So instead of home state, so we can just call this detail state. Okay, and here we are not going to have a meal directly, so we're going to have a meal X. And this is going to be a nullable one. So everything we are going to leave it as a default here. Okay. Now the next case, we can create our state. Okay, so inside here, I'm going to create a function that is going to be executed to fetch a meal by ID. So we can just call this fetch meal. So here we have to get an ID of type string. Okay, so we can use here view model. Sorry, we can use our view model scope. So here we can fetch the email by ID. And after we get the mail we want to collect. Now here we are going to receive the result. Call this result. Similarly, here we can use a when statement. So let's directly go to here. So we can just copy this because this is just a similar. Okay, so instead of home state, we can just call here our detailed state. So here is going to be only a single result. So we have data meals. Then we can receive the first item and change it. And here we can change for detailed state and copy it. So you can see here everything is looking perfectly. So we have only a single function that is going to fetch the meal database. Now we can focus on creating the detailed screen. So let's create here a Kotlin class. Let's call this detail screen. Okay, we can create here a composable. Let's call this detailed screen. Okay, so here I'm going to pass in the detailed view model. Similarly, we can just call here the view model class. Another case, we want to get the ID, which is just of type string, and also the navigate back. So because we are going to start from the home screen, then we can navigate to this detailed screen. Now we can use different aspects in order to navigate from this. Okay, so for this case, we can get our detailed state. So let's call this detailed state. And we can collect it as a state and import the get value. Okay, so I'm going to use a launched effect. So call here launched effect. So this one I call the side effect in Jepar Compose. So this one is going to be executed only once. So, or whenever I pass in here a key. So if I pass a key, whenever it changes, then it's going to call this launched effect. And this one here is just a coroutine scope which can be executed here. So for here, I can just call a detailed view model, and I want to fetch the email by ID. And basically here is just going to be the ID which we have. So at the first time, we're going to make this execution and pass in that ID. Okay, so we can create here our data. Going to be inside the column, and here I can give it a modifier. The first item here, which I want to show, is the icon button. That is going to be the navigation. And here we have the on click. And whenever we click this, I can call here the navigate back. Next case, we have to pass in here the icon. So let's use the image vector. And use here the icons. Auto mirrored. We can call arrow back to indicate that. For content description, you can just pass in here null, or you can say anything which you want. Okay, so similarly here, we can go to our home screen. Let's copy these two. Press Ctrl C. Let's go back to here and we can paste it here. So instead of home state, we're going to use detailed state. Okay, so now we have shown our loading, and also whenever we have any errors. So let's create here a lazy column. Let's display an item. So here we are using a lazy column to have that scrollability for our column whenever we have an item, or you can use a state and a column, but I'm just going to leave this because it's going to be a simple one. So here we can call our detailed state, and we want to achieve our meals. Now we can check here .let, because this one can be nullable. So we don't want to access this when it's nullable. So for this case, I'm going to use an async image to show first that image. So let's create here a model. Okay, so here we're going to have the meal. So we can call here meal. And use that thumb in order to fetch, because this is the URL. And let's give it a height. So here we can give it 400 dp. Okay, so here we can pass in rounded corner. We can give it 80 dp. Okay, so here we can display our image. Now after that, let's create a spacer. 16 dp. Okay, so here we're using just a single item, not items. Bear in mind for that. Okay, so the next case, we can copy so directly we can just go here to our home screen. What we want is this particular text here. So let's just copy this and return inside here our detailed screen, and we can paste this here. Okay, so we can delete this modifier here and leave everything as it is. So here we have our meal. The next case, we can just copy this, and here let's paste. And we want to have a height of 8 dp. Now we can create another text. So here we want to show the instructions, which are going to be here. Now we can change the style. And here we can use body 1 to display that particular style. So let's copy this paste it here, and we're going to have for DP. Now, lastly, we can just duplicate this, press Ctrl D. Let's keep it here instead of instruction. Now, we can just provide the area, for example, where it is coming from. Then here, instead of body 1, we can differentiate these to subtitle 1, for example. So our detailed screen is actually completed here. Okay, so we have two screens. Now we want to display this differently depending on the runtime. So whenever a user is going to click that, then we can navigate to detail the screen of a specific mail item. So we can use a compose library, or we can easily just use our own navigation scheme, which we can easily define here. And that is really easy. So for example, here, we can create an enum class. Let's just go above here. And let's call this screen. And here we have the home and also the detail. Now inside here, we can create a state that we can keep track of. So and we can use a mutable state, and by default, our starting here is going to be our home screen. Okay, so we import get and set values. And also we want to get the particular ID, which is going to be selected so that we can create our detailed screen. So we can call this selected ID. And here we can use another remember, similarly a mutable state of an empty string by default. Okay, so instead of displaying the home screen directly here, we're going to use a when statement. So let's call here when current screen. So our first is home screen. So now we can show the home screen. Now here, whenever we click a particular item inside the home screen, we want to change the current screen. So we can call here screen.detail. And also we can change the selected ID. So here we can call it .id meal. So basically, whenever you don't rename this, it's directly going to be called it. The next case is whenever we have the detail. So here we can call our detailed screen. We can just call here our selected ID. So ID. And here we have the navigate back function, which we can easily change now our current selected ID. So we can call here current selected ID. And now we are going to navigate back to home. Another case, we can call here the selected ID. And this one is just going to be an empty string. Okay, so here we have our item. Now let's try to run this first inside our Android application and just call this compose app. So here is our app launched inside Android. So you can see here we have our data and it's beautifully displayed. Okay, now let's click this one, for example. You can see we are getting the detailed and also it is perfectly displayed here. And we can just keep scrolling whenever we have the datas. Let's try to click this. Then it's navigating us back. Now let's try to run this for desktop. So we can click here. So our app is launched successfully for desktop, and also here we have our data. Whenever we load, you can see they are loading here. Okay, now let's look at this creamy tomato soup. And you can see we are loading here and getting the information about this. Let's click back. And here we have this one. So everything is working perfectly as expected. So guys, let's leave it here for this video. If you enjoyed, actually, please provide a like, subscribe, and share this video. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. So until next time, bye bye for now.